In 1993, when Ethan Parker disappeared from our small town, it felt as if the ground beneath our feet had suddenly shifted, leaving us grasping at shadows and unanswered questions. He was only 15, full of restless energy, dreams yet unspoken, and a stubborn streak that sometimes worried us but never prepared us for the silence that would follow his vanishing. The night he didn't come home, I remember pacing the creaking floors of our modest house, calling his name into the darkness, each unanswered echo tightening the knot in my chest. The police came quickly, their words clipped and practiced, labeling Ethan a runaway before we even had the chance to process the chaos that had enveloped us. That label felt like a cruel dismissal, a way to close the case without truly looking, as if a teenage rebellion explained away the sharp ache in our hearts and the frantic fear that something far worse had happened. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but the phone never rang with news. No footprints appeared on our doorstep, and the town's murmurs shifted from sympathy to skepticism, as if Ethan's absence was his own choice, and our pain a mere consequence of youthful defiance. Every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary day was shadowed by his absence. The empty chair at the dinner table, a silent accusation that we had failed him, or worse, that we had let him slip away without truly fighting to bring him back. The police files grew thicker with time, yet thinner with hope. Their cold indifference reflected in the lack of fresh leads, the waning resources, and the quiet that filled the empty spaces where urgency once lived. I often wondered if Ethan was out there somewhere, lost and scared, or if the town's forgetting was the final erasure of his story, a slow fading into a past we were supposed to forget but never could. Nights were the hardest, when the silence screamed the loudest, and I lay awake, tracing memories of his laughter, the way his eyes lit up at simple joys, and the dreams he shared beneath whispered stars, all fragments of a life paused mid-breath. Friends and neighbors stopped asking after him, their eyes diverting, as if speaking his name was too painful, or worse, unnecessary, and I felt more alone than ever, wrestling with the hope that refused to die and the reality that kept offering only cold shadows. The town carried on. Children grew up. Streets changed. But for me, time stood still, locked in that endless moment of waiting, aching and silent pleading for a miracle that never came. Through it all, the label of runaway hung over us like a judgment, a barrier that kept many from digging deeper, from seeing the truth beyond a teenager's restless heart. And I vowed silently to never let Ethan's story be reduced to a footnote or a convenient excuse. The years that followed were a battlefield of grief and resilience, of holding on to fading hope and confronting the unbearable weight of unanswered questions. And though the world around me moved forward, I remained caught in that liminal space, desperate for the day when the silence would finally break and bring Ethan home. Ethan's disappearance didn't just leave an empty space where he once was. It shattered the delicate fabric of our family in ways I never could have imagined, fracturing bonds that once felt unbreakable and replacing them with silence, blame, and grief that seeped into every corner of our lives. My mother, Claire, was the heart of our family, a woman of fierce love and unyielding hope. But the loss of Ethan crushed her spirit in ways no one could see at first, and though she clung desperately to the belief that he was still out there somewhere, alive and waiting to come home, the rest of us struggled under the weight of reality, caught between supporting her and trying to find some semblance of normalcy in a world that had irrevocably changed. The years after Ethan vanished were marked by a slow unraveling, as arguments once brushed aside erupted into open wounds, fingers pointed in frustration, and quiet dinners turned into rooms filled with tears and unspoken accusations. My father, once steady and strong, withdrew into himself, burdened by guilt and helplessness, while my siblings and I felt lost, caught in the crossfire of grief and confusion, watching as our family's foundation cracked beneath the strain of unanswered questions. The town around us, once a close-knit community where everyone's business was known and shared, became a place of whispers and sideways glances, where the story of Ethan's disappearance was twisted into rumors and half-truths that painted him as a troubled, careless boy who had brought this fate upon himself. A cruel narrative that only deepened my mother's isolation and hardened her resolve to prove them all wrong. I remember how her eyes would darken when she heard those whispers, how her shoulders stiffened, as if she were carrying not just her own grief, but the weight of every judgment cast our way. And yet, she never faltered, becoming a fierce protector of Ethan's memory, even as the world seemed determined to forget. At times, the fractures within our family seemed too wide to bridge, with love battling against the bitterness and despair that threatened to consume us, and moments of tenderness were shadowed by the fear that we might never heal, that the loss of Ethan would define us forever. But beneath the pain, there was also a stubborn spark of hope, a quiet determination that this fracture was not the end, that somehow, through the haze of grief and the maze of blame, we could find a way back to each other and to the son we had lost. The years blurred into a tapestry of heartache and resilience as we each navigated our own paths through sorrow, some retreating into silence, others fighting to keep Ethan's story alive. And through it all, my mother remained the unyielding force that refused to let his memory fade into the shadows. The fractures left by Ethan's disappearance would forever mark our lives, but they also revealed the depth of our love, the complexity of grief, and the power of hope to hold us together even when everything else seemed broken. As the years slipped quietly past, Ethan's disappearance became one of those haunting stories that linger in the background, a cold case gathering dust on police shelves and fading from the vivid memory of the town into the shadows of forgotten headlines and whispered rumors. I remember how fiercely my mother, Claire, fought to keep his name alive, tirelessly petitioning, pleading, and demanding that the investigation be reopened, her voice often falling on deaf ears as the authorities moved on to newer cases and more pressing matters, leaving her desperate calls and heartfelt letters unanswered or met with cold bureaucratic indifference. The files that once held promise of clues and leads were now yellowed and neglected, a tangible symbol of the world's growing apathy to our pain. The once bustling community that had rallied around us in the first frantic days now seemed to distance itself, as if Ethan's absence was a chapter closed, a story no longer worth the time or attention. And their silence felt like another loss, layered upon the original one. I recall the heavy weight of loneliness that settled over our family during those years, the creeping realization that hope was becoming an elusive, fading ember, and the frustration that simmered beneath the surface, fueled by the sense that justice was slipping through our fingers like grains of sand. Each anniversary of Ethan's disappearance brought a fresh wave of grief, a stark reminder that time was not healing but erasing, and yet my mother refused to let go. She held tight to the fragments of memory, old photographs, his favorite jacket hanging untouched in the closet, the worn skateboard leaning against the wall, clinging to the tangible pieces of a life paused in an agonizing limbo. Sometimes I would find her late at night, poring over police reports and news clippings, her eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights spent chasing shadows of leads that never materialized, her heart aching with a fierce determination that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. The community's occasional nods of sympathy felt like distant echoes compared to the roaring support of those early days, replaced now by a quiet avoidance, a collective effort to forget the tragedy that had shattered so many lives. I could sense the unsaid thoughts behind the polite smiles, the unspoken judgments that labeled Ethan a runaway, that dismissed our pain as the inevitable consequence of youthful rebellion, and the sting of those judgments deepened the isolation that had already begun to pull us apart. Yet, beneath the weight of neglect and fading memories, there was still a flicker of resistance, a stubborn refusal to accept that Ethan's story was over, that the answers would never come. My mother's fight was a quiet rebellion against forgetting, a beacon of hope in the growing darkness of silence, and through her perseverance, I learned that some truths refuse to die, no matter how cold the case or how deep the shadows may seem. In 2025, more than 3 decades after Ethan disappeared, the quiet town was stirred awake by an unexpected discovery at a local storage facility holding an auction for unpaid lockers, where one long-forgotten unit, dusty and locked tight for years, suddenly became the center of attention because it was registered under Ethan's name, a name that had once echoed through the streets with hope and fear, but had since slipped into a faded whisper. When the auctioneer's hammer finally fell and the lock was pried open, the contents inside revealed a trove of personal belongings that instantly reignited the mystery surrounding Ethan's disappearance and sent shockwaves through a community that had long resigned itself to the past. Inside the locker were boxes overflowing with forgotten memories, old photographs yellowed with age, tattered diaries filled with handwritten entries capturing the hopes and fears of a boy who had vanished without a trace, worn-out sneakers coated in dust, a cracked skateboard, and even a collection of cassette tapes that seemed frozen in time. Each item was a vivid thread woven into a tapestry of a life abruptly cut short, yet somehow preserved, untouched, and waiting to be understood. I remember the moment my mother, Claire, first laid eyes on the locker's contents, her hands trembling as she reached for a crumpled photo of Ethan, smiling with that youthful glow we had all cherished. A mix of disbelief and rekindled hope, flooding her face. Hope that was both fragile and fierce, the kind that drives a mother to keep searching even when the world has moved on. The community's reaction was swift and intense, with old friends and neighbors drawn back into the story, their memories surfacing like ripples on a pond disturbed after years of stillness, sparking conversations and theories that had been buried beneath the dust of time. Local news crews descended, cameras capturing Claire's emotional discovery and the solemn faces of those who remembered Ethan not as a runaway but as a boy lost to secrets and silence. The locker became a symbol, a physical link between past and present, a reminder that the truth had not been erased but patiently waiting in the shadows to be found. As investigators sifted through the belongings, each item was examined with renewed scrutiny. Every diary entry and photograph a clue, pointing to the complex web of Ethan's life and the hidden struggles he faced before his disappearance. The auction, initially a routine event, transformed into a turning point that breathed new life into the cold case, compelling us all to confront memories we had tried to forget and truths we were not ready to face. Amid the swirl of emotions, shock, hope, fear, and determination, there was a shared sense that this was just the beginning, that the answers we had sought for so long might finally be within reach, and that Ethan's story was far from over. When the locker was finally opened, the dusty air stirred with the weight of years lost, and as I carefully sifted through its contents, I was struck by how these long-forgotten items painted a picture of Ethan's life that was far more complex and fragile than the simple runaway label that had been slapped on him so quickly all those years ago. Inside, there were diaries bound with worn leather covers, their pages yellowed and edges frayed, filled with handwriting that revealed Ethan's inner world, his fears, his dreams, and a sense of isolation that none of us had truly understood before. Words that spoke of a boy caught between childhood and a harsh reality he was struggling to face. Scattered among the diaries were photographs, some joyful snapshots of family gatherings and school days, but others darker and more haunting images of Ethan alone, gazing out windows or sitting in empty rooms, his eyes carrying a weight far beyond his years. As if he was searching for something no one else could see or give. There were notes folded neatly in pockets and envelopes, hints of secret fears and pleas for help that had never reached the people who mattered most, and objects like a broken watch, a half-finished drawing, and a tattered backpack that whispered stories of a boy trying to hold himself together in a world that felt overwhelming and unforgiving. As I laid out each item, it became painfully clear that Ethan's disappearance was not just about a rebellious teenager running away, but a young soul wrestling with struggles hidden beneath the surface. Struggles that had been missed, ignored, or misunderstood by those around him. The more I uncovered, the more questions surfaced. Who knew about these struggles? Why was he left to face them alone? What had been silenced by fear, shame, or indifference? Each new clue was a thread pulling me deeper into a tangled web of secrets and lies that had cloaked Ethan's life and disappearance. It was as if the locker held the echoes of his voice, finally speaking after decades of silence, demanding to be heard and understood. My heart ached with a mix of sorrow and frustration, realizing how much had been lost in the assumptions and dismissals, and how those failures had contributed to the long silence that followed. These discoveries shifted everything, challenging the narrative the town had accepted and forcing me to confront the truth that Ethan's story was far more painful and complicated than anyone had admitted. The diaries and photographs were not just relics of the past, they were pieces of a puzzle I was determined to solve, keys to unlocking the mystery that had haunted my family for over 30 years. As I carefully packed the items to share with Detective Marcus Reed, I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders, knowing that these fragments of Ethan's hidden life held the power to change everything, to rewrite a story marred by neglect and misunderstanding, and to finally bring justice to the boy who had been forgotten too soon. In that quiet moment, surrounded by memories and unanswered questions, I realized that the search for truth was no longer just about finding Ethan, but about giving him back his voice, his story, and the dignity he deserved all along. Years had passed since Ethan vanished, and yet the ache in my chest had never dulled, never allowed me to rest or forget. So when the news came that a storage locker tied to his name had been found and opened, a surge of emotions crashed over me, like a tidal wave I hadn't expected. I was pulled back into that relentless search, my heart trembling between cautious hope and the sharp edge of fear. I remember sitting alone in the quiet of my living room, the afternoon sunlight casting soft patterns across the worn floor as I clutched a fragile photograph of Ethan, the lines of his youthful face seeming both impossibly distant and heartbreakingly near, while the voice of the news anchor replayed in my mind, describing the dusty trove of belongings discovered after decades of silence. Hope flickered inside me, fragile, yet fierce, like a single candle burning in a vast, dark room, lighting a path that had once seemed forever lost, while fear wrapped its cold fingers around my ribs, whispering warnings of secrets best left buried and truths too painful to bear. The locker's contents weren't just forgotten objects, they were echoes of a life interrupted, pieces of a story waiting to be told. and I was desperate to hear what they had to say. Every diary entry, every faded photograph, every worn-out item became a lifeline, a thread connecting me to the son I had lost, and the boy he had been before silence swallowed him whole. But along with hope came the dread that the secrets these items held might shatter the fragile peace I'd fought to build in the years since his disappearance, that the truth could reopen wounds too deep to heal or reveal, betrayals hidden in plain sight. I thought about the nights I'd spent sleepless, haunted by dreams of Ethan, wondering where he was, if he was safe, if he remembered us. And now the possibility that answers were within reach filled me with a cautious urgency I hadn't felt in years. The community around me seemed to awaken from its long slumber. Old friends reached out, and whispers began anew. But amidst the growing attention, I felt the weight of loneliness more keenly than ever, knowing that no matter how many people came forward, or how many theories surfaced, the search was still mine to carry. I found myself reaching out to Detective Marcus Reed, a man whose quiet dedication and sharp insight gave me a glimmer of reassurance. Someone who seemed to understand that this was not just a case, but a mother's desperate plea for justice. As we began to piece together the fragments unearthed from that storage locker, each revelation felt like stepping into unknown territory, full of promise and peril, and I realized that this journey was no longer just about finding Ethan, but about reclaiming his story and the truth that had been buried alongside his absence. Hope was rekindled, but so was the knowledge that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, heartbreak, and difficult truths. Yet, I was ready to face whatever came next, because the love for my son was a fire that would never be extinguished. As the days passed after the discovery of Ethan's belongings in that storage locker, a new chapter began to unfold, pulling me deeper into a world I thought I knew, but that was now revealing secrets I never imagined. Alongside Detective Marcus Reed, whose steady determination became a beacon of hope in the fog of years lost, we started to uncover new leads that slowly stitched together a hidden narrative of Ethan's last days. The diaries and photos we found acted as keys that unlocked doors long sealed, leading us to old friends who had once shared laughter and secrets with Ethan, but had remained silent through fear or loyalty, distant relatives who had drifted away yet held pieces of the puzzle, and neighbors who, after years of quiet watchfulness, were finally willing to speak about the whispers and shadows they had seen, but never dared to explain. Each conversation brought a mix of relief and pain relief that the silence was breaking. Pain at the stories of struggles Ethan faced alone, the betrayals he endured, and the walls he built around himself to hide the pain from a world that seemed ready to overlook him. I remember sitting in a small, dimly lit cafe with Marcus as he carefully transcribed an interview with a childhood friend of Ethan's, who spoke of a secret meeting the night before his disappearance, a meeting no one had ever known about until now. And as the pieces began to fit, a portrait of a boy caught between hope and despair emerged, one who had been searching for a way out of a tangled web of family tensions, school pressures, and hidden dangers. Neighbors described strange visitors, unexplained late-night noises, and a growing unease in the weeks leading up to Ethan's vanishing, details that the original investigation had missed or dismissed. As more witnesses came forward, a complex picture unfolded, one of silenced voices, hidden conflicts, and a community grappling with truths too uncomfortable to face for decades. With each new piece of evidence, the case moved from cold to cautiously warm, and while the weight of years pressed heavily on my heart, there was a quiet thrill in the chase, a feeling that we were finally peeling back the layers that had cloaked Ethan's disappearance in mystery. The town, once resigned to forget, now buzzed with whispers and speculation, as if the shadows of the past were stirring, forcing everyone to confront what had been left unspoken for so long. Marcus's unwavering commitment gave me strength on days when despair threatened to overwhelm me, reminding me that the fight for truth was never over, and that every voice mattered, especially those who had been silent too long. Despite the pain and uncertainty, I found solace in the fact that Ethan's story was no longer being written in isolation, but was shared by a community beginning to heal through acknowledgement and reckoning. As we pieced together fragments of a boy's life lost to time, I held on to the hope that with every truth uncovered, we moved closer to the justice and closure Ethan deserved, and that his memory, once buried beneath layers of silence, would finally be honored and understood. As Marcus and I delved deeper into Ethan's life, the glossy surface of our quiet town began to peel away, revealing dark, unsettling truths that had been buried beneath years of silence and denial. What we uncovered was a web of abuse and betrayal, threads tangled through Ethan's final days and extending far beyond what anyone had imagined, painting a grim picture of a boy caught in a struggle against forces both seen and unseen, while a circle of people, friends, neighbors, and even family, had chosen secrecy over truth, their silence acting like a shadow that stretched across time and generations. Each revelation hit me like a blow, shaking the foundations of everything I thought I knew about our community. A place I had always believed was safe, where everyone watched out for one another, but now seemed like a stage for hidden fears and whispered threats. The more Marcus and I uncovered, the more it became clear that Ethan's disappearance was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a larger pattern of abuse that had been ignored, minimized, or actively concealed by those who feared the consequences of exposure. I remember the cold sweat breaking out on my skin during one late night as we sifted through old police reports and personal testimonies, the weight of betrayal settling like a stone in my chest as I realized how deeply entrenched the complicity ran, how much had been sacrificed in the name of preserving appearances and protecting reputations. There were names we encountered again and again, adults who wielded influence and power, people who used their status to silence victims and intimidate witnesses, leaving a trail of broken lives and shattered trust. The investigation revealed corners of the town where fear had thrived in the shadows, where Ethan's cries for help had echoed unheard, muffled by those who refused to see or chose to look away. With each new piece of evidence, the facade of tranquility cracked, exposing the ugly truths that had festered beneath the surface, and I felt a mixture of horror and determination, horror at the cruelty inflicted on a boy I loved so dearly, and determination to ensure that the darkness he endured would not be forgotten or repeated. The people who had kept these secrets for decades now faced the light, their silence no longer a shield but a chain that bound them to the consequences of their actions. Amidst the pain, I found strength in Marcus's unwavering support and in the growing chorus of voices from survivors and allies, each telling their stories, each demanding justice. The community that once tried to hide from its past was now forced to confront it, to reckon with the scars left by betrayal and neglect. And while the road ahead promised to be difficult and painful, it was also a path toward healing and truth. As I stood beside Marcus, holding the pieces of Ethan's shattered story in my hands, I understood that uncovering the past was not just about bringing closure to a family, but about challenging a culture of silence and creating space for voices long silenced to finally be heard and believed. For years, the silence around Ethan's disappearance felt impenetrable, as if the town itself had swallowed the truth whole and left us grasping at shadows. But everything changed the day. Mr. Caldwell, The reclusive neighbor who lived at the end of our street finally stepped forward with a heavy heart and a trembling voice to share what he had seen that fateful night. For decades, he had kept his observations to himself, trapped by fear and the weight of isolation, afraid that speaking out would bring danger upon him or stir up the quiet life he desperately clung to. But when he finally revealed that he had seen Ethan just hours before he vanished alone, nervous, and looking over his shoulder as if pursued by unseen eyes, it was as if a dam had burst and the investigation surged forward with new energy and urgency. I remember sitting with Marcus Reed in the cramped living room of Mr. Caldwell's small, cluttered house, the air thick with years of unspoken truths, as the elderly man recounted the details that had haunted him silently for so long, the dark figure lurking near the park, the sudden hush that fell over the neighborhood, and the whispered threats that had chased Ethan into the night. His words painted a vivid, haunting picture of a boy trapped not by choice but by circumstances darker than we had imagined. A boy who had been watched and hunted in ways none of us had dared to believe. As he spoke, I could see the toll that silence had taken on him. The haunted eyes, the trembling hands, and the overwhelming relief mixed with regret that finally he could share his burden. Yet the weight of years of secrecy still lingered like a shadow in the room. Mr. Caldwell's testimony reshaped the investigation, forcing law enforcement to revisit overlooked evidence and re-examine witnesses who had previously remained silent or dismissed. And suddenly, the case shifted from cold to urgent, a race against time to piece together a puzzle that had been scattered for too long. For me, the neighbor's courage ignited a renewed flame of hope and determination, a reminder that even the quietest voices could break through the thickest walls of secrecy, and that the truth was not lost but waiting for someone brave enough to find it. The town, once steeped in denial and fear, now faced the ripple effects of this revelation, as neighbors who had kept their distance began to question what else had been hidden beneath the surface of their seemingly peaceful streets. The silence that had once suffocated us was cracking, and with every word spoken, the path toward justice grew clearer, yet also more perilous, as those responsible for Ethan's disappearance were forced out of the shadows. Standing beside Marcus after the interview, I felt a mix of gratitude and sorrow. Gratitude for the courage of a man who broke decades of silence, and sorrow for the years lost to fear and silence that could have changed everything. This moment was a turning point, a beacon cutting through the darkness, signaling that the fight for truth was far from over. But now, we were no longer alone in our search. Armed with the knowledge that even the silent witnesses held the power to change the course of a story written in silence and shadows. The moment I realized the truth was coming to light was one of the hardest in my life, a collision of raw pain and bitter betrayal as I stood face to face with people who had lied, hidden, or turned away from Ethan's suffering for years, their carefully constructed walls of silence crumbling before my desperate need for answers. It was as if the town's peaceful facade was peeling away, revealing the shadows beneath shadows filled with fear, greed, and a willingness to protect their own reputations at the expense of a boy who had vanished into silence. I remember one confrontation vividly, sitting across a worn kitchen table from a neighbor who had once been a friend, her eyes avoiding mine as I pressed for the truth. And in that silence, the weight of her guilt was heavier than any words she could have spoken. She fidgeted with a cracked coffee cup, her voice barely a whisper, as she admitted to knowing more than she had ever told the police. Her reasons tangled in fear and loyalty that had kept her mute when it mattered most. With every confession, I felt the walls closing in around us, the magnitude of the betrayal sinking deeper into my heart. but also a fierce determination to break the cycle of silence that had allowed this darkness to thrive for so long. The town meetings I attended grew heated as more voices joined the chorus of revelations, some filled with regret and others with defiance, as families and neighbors grappled with their roles in a painful history they wished they could erase. I saw old friendships fracture and new alliances form, all under the heavy weight of truths that no longer could be ignored. The media attention that followed cast a harsh light on the community, exposing corruption, negligence, and the devastating consequences of turning a blind eye. Every article, every televised interview was a reminder that justice was no longer just a hope, but an urgent demand, and that the silence which had cloaked Ethan's disappearance was finally being pierced by voices that refused to be silenced. Throughout these painful confrontations, I found myself wrestling with a complex mix of emotions: anger at the betrayal, sorrow for the years lost, and a cautious hope that this reckoning might finally bring peace. The people who had once been pillars of the community were unmasked as protectors of secrets that had cost a boy his life, and their fall from grace was as dramatic as it was necessary. As I stood in the town hall, listening to testimonies and watching the faces of those who had concealed the truth, I knew that the path ahead would be long and difficult, filled with legal battles and healing wounds, but it was a path I was ready to walk. The love I had for Ethan was the fuel that kept me moving forward, a constant reminder that exposing the truth was not just about punishment, but about honor and justice for the son I lost. In the unraveling of this darkness, I saw the first glimmers of light that promised the town could change, that families could heal, and that silence would never again be the price paid for safety. This confrontation was the beginning of a new chapter, one where the truth would finally be heard, and the legacy of silence would be replaced by a legacy of courage and remembrance. The breakthrough came like a sudden, sharp breath of air after years of suffocating silence, when Marcus and I traced Ethan's last known movements to a remote cabin tucked deep within the tangled woods, just beyond the edges of town, a place that had remained hidden, untouched, and forgotten by most, but that held the key to the mystery that had haunted us for decades. I remember the moment we pulled up the overgrown dirt path, the sun dipping low behind the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper the secrets the cabin had kept locked away, and as we stepped onto the creaking porch, my heart pounded with a mixture of dread and hope, knowing that whatever we found inside could finally piece together the fractured puzzle of Ethan's disappearance or shatter the fragile hope I still clung to. The cabin's weathered wood and cracked windows told stories of neglect and secrecy, and inside, the air was thick with dust and memories, a stillness that felt heavy with the weight of years untouched. As we carefully explored each room, our flashlights cutting through the gloom, we uncovered physical evidence, a torn piece of clothing that matched descriptions from Ethan's last days, a faded journal with entries hinting at fear and desperation, and traces of footprints in the soil around the back door that suggested a hurried departure or perhaps an arrival not meant to be noticed. Every item we uncovered was a thread pulling me deeper into a reality I had long avoided, a reality where Ethan had been trapped in circumstances far darker than any of us had imagined. A reality where the answers I sought were etched in the quiet corners of this lonely cabin. I could feel the tension coiling in my chest as Marcus carefully photographed each piece of evidence, his calm professionalism grounding me even as my mind raced with questions and the crushing weight of what these discoveries might mean. The air seemed to hold its breath alongside me, as if the cabin itself was waiting for justice to finally be served, for the truth to break free from the shadows it had hidden in for so long. I thought about the boy Ethan was the laughter that once filled our home, the dreams he whispered late at night, the smiles that lit up the darkest days, and I felt a surge of determination to carry his story forward, to ensure that this place of secrets would no longer be a prison, but a chapter of truth and remembrance. As we prepared to leave, the fading light cast a golden glow through the cracked windows, illuminating dust particles that danced like tiny stars in the quiet room. And I realized that this cabin, once a silent witness to pain and disappearance, was now a beacon of hope, a place where the long-buried story of Ethan could finally begin to be told, though the path ahead was uncertain and likely filled with more pain. This discovery marked a turning point, proof that the silence could be broken, that the search for justice was not in vain, and that the love of a mother, relentless and unyielding, could uncover even the darkest secrets hidden beneath the earth. Inside the cabin, surrounded by the faded walls that seemed to hold their breath along with me, I found myself face to face with the missing piece of Ethan's story, an old, worn diary, tucked beneath a loose floorboard, and personal belongings that spoke louder than words ever could about the boy I had lost and the betrayals he had endured in silence. As I carefully opened the fragile pages, the ink faded but still legible, I read his final diary entry, a raw and heart-wrenching confession filled with fears that had never reached my ears, hopes that flickered despite the darkness closing in, and a chilling revelation about someone he had trusted, someone who had ultimately turned away when he needed them most. The words spilled from the page like a long-held breath finally released, each sentence a thread unraveling the tangled web of secrets and lies that had shrouded his disappearance for so many years, and with every line, I felt Ethan's presence grow stronger, his voice reaching out to me across time, desperate to be heard and understood. Among the personal items was a locket with a faded photograph inside, worn from years of being carried close to his heart. And as I traced the face in the photo, a knot of sorrow and betrayal tightened in my chest because the image revealed the identity of the person who had played a dark role in his fate, someone I never expected. Someone whose betrayal had cut deeper than any wound I could imagine. The weight of this discovery was almost unbearable, like standing on the edge of a cliff where the past and present collided in a storm of grief, anger, and disbelief. And yet, amidst the overwhelming pain, I felt a flicker of fierce determination to bring this truth into the light, no matter how hard or painful the road ahead would be. I recalled the nights I had spent whispering Ethan's name into the void, the endless searches and unanswered prayers, and suddenly, the pieces of the puzzle that had haunted me for so long were falling into place with heartbreaking clarity. The cabin, once a silent witness to secrets, had finally spoken, and its revelations shattered the fragile illusions I had clung to, forcing me to confront the reality that Ethan had not run away but had been trapped in a nightmare of betrayal and silence that few had dared to acknowledge. Marcus stood beside me, his steady presence a comforting anchor as we documented everything carefully. Knowing that this evidence would be crucial in finally seeking justice for Ethan and exposing the darkness that had hidden in plain sight for decades, as I closed the diary and gathered the belongings with trembling hands, I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders, not just to find answers, but to honor Ethan's memory by telling the full truth and ensuring that no more children would suffer in silence. The emotional toll was immense. A storm raging inside me, but beneath it all was a quiet hope. A hope that through this painful unveiling, healing could begin for my family and for a town forced to reckon with its buried past. Armed with the new evidence we had painstakingly uncovered from the cabin and the storage locker, the police finally reopened Ethan's case, transforming years of cold silence into a formal investigation that shook the very core of our town and forced those responsible for hiding the truth into the unforgiving light of justice. The charges filed against individuals who had been complicit in the cover-up were a bittersweet victory, a validation of years of relentless searching and heartbreak, but also the beginning of a grueling legal battle that stretched me thin, testing every ounce of strength I had left as a mother desperate to see her son's story told fully and fairly. I spent countless hours preparing for court, meeting with lawyers, poring over testimonies, and reliving the pain that Ethan's disappearance had inflicted on our family, knowing that the path to justice would be riddled with painful memories, hostile opposition, and the harsh glare of public scrutiny. The courtroom became a stage where the echoes of past betrayals were laid bare, and as witnesses took the stand to recount their stories, some with tears, others with defiant silence, I felt the weight of years of silence lifting, replaced by the raw, aching power of truth finally breaking through the walls of denial and fear. Every piece of evidence, every testimony, was a step closer to reclaiming Ethan's dignity and confronting the people who had chosen self-preservation over the well-being of a child. The legal process was exhausting and often overwhelming, filled with moments where hope flickered faintly against waves of despair. But I held on to the knowledge that this fight was bigger than me, that it was about sending a message that silence and complicity would no longer protect the guilty. Outside the courthouse, the community's response was mixed, with some rallying behind our quest for justice, while others recoiled at the revelations, unwilling to face the darkness that had been hiding in their midst for so long. Friends and strangers alike reached out with words of support and stories of their own, weaving a fragile but growing tapestry of healing that reminded me I was not alone in this battle. Through it all, Marcus Reed remained a steadfast ally, his unwavering commitment and quiet strength a source of comfort as we navigated the complexities of the justice system and the emotional toll it exacted. There were moments when the pain seemed unbearable, when the past threatened to swallow me whole. But each court date, each cross-examination, was a step toward breaking the cycle of silence that had trapped Ethan and so many others. I carried his memory like a torch through the darkest nights, lighting the way for truth and accountability. This fight was not just for justice in a legal sense, but for the restoration of dignity, for the recognition of a boy whose life had been stolen by neglect and deceit. As the trial unfolded, I saw the first real signs of change. Conversations sparked, eyes opened, and the walls of secrecy beginning to crumble. While the road ahead was still uncertain and fraught with challenges, I knew in my heart that this was the moment where Ethan's story, long buried and forgotten, would finally be heard, honored and vindicated, and that justice, though slow and painful, was no longer just a distant hope, but an approaching reality. Though the wounds Ethan's disappearance left were still raw, and the scars ran deep through every part of our family and community, I found a wellspring of strength in the truth that had finally emerged and the slow but growing support of people who refused to let his story be forgotten. The journey toward healing was neither quick nor easy, but as the court proceedings brought justice to those who had betrayed us, and as neighbors and friends began to confront the past openly, I could feel the fragile threads of trust and connection weaving back together where once there had been only silence and suspicion. My family, long fractured by grief and blame, slowly began to find its way back to each other, sharing memories of Ethan, not just the pain of his loss, but the laughter, the dreams, and the boy we loved, so fiercely turning sorrow into a shared tribute. that became a source of comfort rather than division. The community, too, started to change, no longer willing to hide behind whispered rumors or closed doors, but instead gathering in spaces that fostered conversation, remembrance, and a collective reckoning with the failures that had allowed such darkness to fester unchecked. I remember the first vigil held in Ethan's honor after the trial. The soft glow of candles, illuminating faces, once marked by fear and grief, now shining with determination to protect the vulnerable and never again allow silence to be the refuge of injustice. Every tear shed and every hand held was a testament to the power of truth to heal wounds that seemed beyond repair. And I saw in those moments that while the past could never be undone, its hold could loosen, making room for hope and renewal. As the seasons changed, so too did the atmosphere in our town, with new initiatives for youth support, community watch programs, and open forums that encouraged dialogue and empathy, efforts born from the painful lessons etched into our collective memory. For me personally, the healing was a slow unfolding, a daily choice to carry forward Ethan's legacy by living with courage and compassion, refusing to let his story be a tale of despair, but rather a beacon that illuminated the path toward justice and care for others. I found solace in the small moments, a shared smile with a neighbor who once looked away, a quiet conversation with my siblings about dreams once deferred, and the steady presence of friends who stood with me through every painful step of this journey, even on days when grief threatened to overwhelm. I reminded myself that healing was not about forgetting, but about integrating the loss into a new way of being, where love and memory could coexist with pain and resilience. As I stood at Ethan's grave on the anniversary of his disappearance, surrounded by a community that was no longer silent but actively engaged in remembrance and protection, I felt a quiet peace settle over me. A sense that we had not only honored his memory, but had transformed the tragedy into a catalyst for change. The road ahead would still hold challenges and moments of sorrow, but with truth as our foundation and community as our strength, I knew we could continue to heal and build a future where no child would be lost to silence or neglect. This was the legacy Ethan deserved, and it was one I was determined to help create. Years have passed since that day when the storage locker was opened, revealing the pieces of my son Ethan's life that had been hidden away in silence and dust. And as I sit quietly now in the soft glow of evening, I reflect on the long, winding journey from unbearable loss to fragile closure that has shaped every part of who I am. That once forgotten locker, standing silent and neglected for decades, has become a powerful symbol, a testament to the truth that was finally uncovered, the justice that was fiercely sought, and the unyielding love of a mother who never stopped fighting to find her son and tell his story. I remember the countless sleepless nights, the endless days spent piecing together fragments of Ethan's life, and the overwhelming emotions that flooded my heart each time a new revelation surfaced, bringing both pain and hope in equal measure. Through tears and heartache, I learned the true depth of resilience, the kind of strength born from love so fierce it defies the weight of despair and the passage of time. The community that once turned away slowly began to listen and heal, sharing the burden of grief and embracing the need for change that Ethan's story demanded. I often think about the boy. He was his laughter, his dreams, and the quiet moments we shared that now feel like precious treasures. His absence was a void that stretched across years and memories, but through the work of so many, that void has been filled with remembrance, understanding, and a commitment to protect those who remain vulnerable. The fight for justice was neither swift nor easy, but every step forward was a victory against the darkness of neglect and silence that had threatened to consume us all. I hold close the image of Ethan's face in the photographs we found, young and full of life. A reminder that beneath the pain is a story worth telling, a life worth honoring, standing before his grave. I feel the weight of his absence, but also the light of his legacy, a legacy that has transformed pain into purpose and loss into action. I am grateful for the allies who stood with me, Detective Marcus Reed, friends, and strangers who believed in our quest for truth and helped carry the torch when my own strength faltered. Their support has been a lifeline, a reminder that love and justice are never solitary pursuits, but a collective responsibility. As I look to the future, I carry hope that Ethan's story will continue to inspire others to speak out, to fight for those who cannot, and to never let silence be the final answer. The locker that once seemed just a forgotten relic now shines as a beacon of courage and resilience, reminding me daily that even in the darkest places, truth can emerge and love can prevail. Ethan is more than a memory. He is a symbol of the enduring power of a mother's heart, a community's reckoning, and a promise that no child's story will ever be forgotten again.